Today we have our concluding lesson or lecture for our brief survey of early church history. And I want to talk about monasticism, the rise of monasticism. Now, apart from just knowing more about early church history, which in and of itself is good and important, it is also very important for us living here in San Antonio to know a little bit about monasticism. Now, the nickname of San Antonio is, of course, the Mission City. This city exists because of monasticism. It exists because monks and nuns, mostly monks, came over and started these missions up and down the local river. So it is a local topic for us as well. One of the great challenges that we find in the 4th century is that the church has moved from being a church of martyrs to being a church that is established, that is wealthy, that is in some places really quite powerful. It has also moved from being a church where being a deacon or a priest or a bishop could quite possibly mean getting tossed in jail, getting stuff taken away from you, or even martyrdom. And it has moved from that by the end of the century, in a relatively, from an historical point of view, a relatively short period of time. And then it has moved to being quite different, where being a deacon or a priest or a bishop was a really good job in many places, where bishops and clergy had privileges, they had rights and prerogatives that the average citizen did not have in some places. So what we're talking about then in this 4th century is a shift from the church of the martyrs, the church of the persecuted, to the church of the monastics. In the year 300, if you want to know, is someone a solid Christian? Do they have that piety and that zeal? You're going to look at persecution, how they stood up under persecution. Did they run away from persecution when they were tossed in jail? Did they stand up or did they give up? What did they do? But after persecution goes away, 312, 313, Christianity is made to be a legal religion. Later on, around 380, Christianity is made to be the official religion of the empire. You find a real shift. Once the church is well established and powerful, how are people going to show their piety? Because there's no more persecution. So this is when we have really the rise of monasticism. So the church, on a pastoral level, is dealing with a pretty tough situation. In the 4th century, they have this large influx of people. Some of them are not entirely sincere in terms of their motives. They're not entirely sincere in terms of why they want to be baptized, why they want to be a Christian. You did not have this problem before that, because before that, anyone who was going to become a Christian understood and knew that there was a good chance sooner or later that they were going to have to make some substantial sacrifices for this new faith. So this is the challenge of nominalism, right? People becoming Christians not because of a sincere spiritual motive, but because there were benefits to being Christian. During this time also, we have some shifts in terms of how the church operates, and I'm not saying that they're all good or they're all bad. Like with almost all things in the history of the Christian church, there were positive aspects and there were negative aspects as well. So what are some of the shifts that we see during this 4th century? Well, the church obviously could adopt a much higher profile. It didn't have to be underground. It didn't have to be hidden. So for example, Christian events such as the election of a bishop, that would become a public event, and that would be big news. Christian leaders became influential opinion formers. Churches, sometimes very large, very beautiful churches, could be built. Prior to this, a lot of the churches really are home churches, caves. In parts of Africa, they're meeting in cemeteries. But now, churches can be built, beautiful, large churches. Preaching and worship changed in character. And then even in some cities, there was the development of Christian districts. So the whole Christian faith was really undergoing a substantial change. So here's a quote from an historian. It says, "Their miraculous transformation from a persecuted minority into a privileged elite, soon to become a dominant majority, was not an experience for which they were intellectually or spiritually well prepared." So that's a critical comment from one historian. Furthermore, as I mentioned, the clergy are changing their development, and there's also developments in worship. The worship of the church becomes an area where the Christian community is able to draw on all the different arts and the different accomplishments. Prior to the legalization of Christianity and then making it the official religion, there was a lot of value to being brief, not to being very loud, to being mobile. Afterwards, you don't need these things anymore. So this is during the time that we have, for example, the development of church choirs, okay, which we are so used to, we take that for granted. Also, preaching goes from being apparently a very kind of austere exhortation to righteousness to being something much more rhetorical. Many important people are in the church. They're educated. They have studied rhetoric. So they expect the preacher to be someone who will speak to them utilizing the latest and the best in rhetoric and public speaking. This is also, of course, the rise of church buildings. And we also have some changes in terms of baptismal instruction. Prior to this, the period of catechesis, which is the training for baptism, would often be quite lengthy, sometimes 3 years, sometimes even 5 years. And this was very important because you were really making a commitment to put your life on the line, pretty much. So it was kind of a question of quality control. The clergy really wanted to make sure that people who were going to be baptized really understood what they were getting into, that they really had a sincere and well-informed faith. And then, all of a sudden, you have large numbers of people who want to be baptized and admitted to the church quickly, right? So this was a quite difficult time for some of the leaders. During this time, we have a shift in terms of holiness. As I mentioned before, at first it was the persecuted church that demonstrated the holiness of the saint. But then we have a change because persecution really just ceases to exist, at least in the Roman Empire. In other places, persecution will continue to exist. And we need to go to Egypt and talk about a guy named Saint Anthony. Now, this city is named after Saint Anthony of Padua, who was a different saint than Saint Anthony of Egypt, or Saint Anthony of the desert, as he's often called. So Saint Anthony of the desert, this is a Christian who lived in Alexandria, which, as we have spoken of before, was one of the principal Christian cities in the whole Roman Empire. And I'll give you the short version. One day he's there at church and he hears the gospel reading where Jesus says to the young man, "Go and sell everything that you have and give it to the poor, and then follow me." And you know what he does? He actually does it, right? He actually does literally what Jesus said. And he was a wealthy man. So he sold all of his real estate, his holdings, and he left some money to his sister so that she would be cared for. And then he decided to retreat and to try to live like Jesus. So this is the beginning of the development of what we call today the evangelical vows. Evangelical vows. Now, what are the 3 evangelical vows if someone is going to become a monk or a nun? Chastity, humility, poverty, chastity, poverty, and obedience. Yeah. So the idea is that they're evangelical not because they're related to what we call evangelical Christianity today, but they're evangelical because they are modeled for us in the evangel, in the very gospel. So really this is an attempt to try to live just like Jesus. What would Jesus do? He would be poor, he would be obedient, and he would be chaste, right? So this is what would Jesus do, but the 4th century version of it. And they didn't have bracelets, unfortunately. So that is what would you... And so Anthony does this. And he retreats and he is alone. Now what's the Greek word for someone who is alone? Monakos. Monakos. And so that's where we get the word monasticism, monastery, or monk from. A monk is a person who is monakos, who withdraws from the city. Okay. Now, very quickly, in Egypt, we have a flourishing of different types of monasticism. A flourishing of different types of monasticism. Now, Anthony, and incidentally, Anthony, the reason we know so much about him, although some of these are surely legends, some of the stories we have, it's because a certain guy that we ran into before, Athanasius, anybody remember that guy? Athanasius? He writes for us the life of Antony. Okay, so these are contemporaries. These guys are around during the same time. And that life of Antony, written by St. Athanasius, will travel far and wide, including into Europe, and will inspire different monastic movements in Europe. I don't know if we'll have time for this today, but we'll find later on that monasticism in the East will develop quite differently than monasticism in the West. But that's kind of getting a little bit ahead of where we need to be right now. So Anthony then withdraws, right? I don't think there's the idea that one has to withdraw from society in order to be a solid Christian or a pure, a holy person. But you certainly have some of those examples in the Bible, right? We have Elijah, who's living all on his own. We have John the Baptist, who withdraws from society to go live in the wilderness. And we even have Jesus, who at times would also withdraw, and he would be monakos, he would be alone, spending his time on prayer, reflection, fasting, this sort of thing. Anthony's life was also characterized by asceticism. So asceticism is the idea of disciplining the physical body and learning to completely control all of your appetites. So that could mean wearing uncomfortable clothing. It could mean being barefoot. There's a whole monastic order that it's in their name. They're descalced, which is a fancy way of saying we don't wear shoes. Okay. In some places, the monastic ideal became really weird. Okay, and I'll give you some examples of that here in a little while. But Anthony practiced asceticism, and he withdrew. But his reputation developed and grew. And so people would hear about this man who was living like Jesus, who was living according to these evangelical vows, and how he had power to battle with the devil and with demons, and how he had this profound wisdom that he had gained from all of his time in Scripture and in prayer. So people would go out to Anthony and ask for prayer, ask for his advice, seek his wisdom out. And then a number of young men were like, hey, we like what you're doing, so we're going to take these vows as well, and we're going to do what you're doing. And then so Anthony, as the story goes, he's like, well, that's fantastic. So he had to move even further into the wilderness, right? Because the whole point is that he wanted to be alone. So we have the development of different types of monasticism. So this type of monasticism that we can sort of see like really being all alone, completely alone, not living as part of a monastery or convent, we'll get there in a minute. What is that called? What do we call that person, the guy who lives in the cave up in the mountain and he only comes down?
Hermit.
A hermit, good. And so it's what we call eremitical monasticism. Eremitical, and that's where we get the word hermit. So this really is a person who completely withdraws from all of society as best they can. This is a kind of monasticism that's pretty hardcore. I do know of a couple of hermits that continue to exist. heard that there's like an old guy living on Mount Lebanon, and in the Orthodox Church you're going to find some of this, but this is a pretty rare form of monasticism. Now, what are some other forms of monasticism? Not everybody, and by the way, the life for St. Anthony, circa 250 through 356, so just so you have an idea of when he's alive. Well, there was another man named Pomus, and this was a military man. This is also in Egypt. Pomus, he retires from military life, and he feels called also to ask him this question: what would Jesus do? How can I live like Jesus? Pomus, however, is not interested in the eremitical monasticism. He doesn't want to be a hermit. And he's a very organized guy. He's a regimented person because he comes from the military. So Pomus is going to organize a form of monasticism, but where people can live together. So we call this cenobitic monasticism. So this is a monastery in the full sense, as we tend to think of these today, in which monks lived a communal life. The community was involved in worship, working, and caring for others. And the years for Pomus are 290 through 345. So again, this is all 4th century what we're looking at. He founded a monastery in Tbilisi, which is about 300 miles south of Alexandria. So we have the eremitical monasticism, we have the cenobitic monasticism, and between those two we have what we can call semi-eremitical. And this really is just a compromise. So you have people living alone, but maybe on a weekly basis they will all gather together for worship, for service, probably not. This is one of the critiques of heremitical monasticism, right? As one of the early church fathers who was quite critical of this form of monasticism, he said, if you're living alone, you have no one else's feet to wash. Okay, we will see that even among these different types of monasticism, there's a good amount of controversy. There's a good amount of controversy even among these different monks, and talking about what is the monastic ideal? What should monasticism look like? Well, that having been said, though, let me give you a brief list of some of the main features of monastic life, whether it was eremitical, semi-eremitical, or cenobitic. So one of them is devotion to the Bible, reading the Bible, and to prayer. Another one was freedom from passions. That's that ascetic practice, right? You want to be able to dominate the passions of the flesh. And you do this by submitting your flesh to quite rigorous and difficult trials. So an example of this that we get from an Egyptian monk named Evagrius, this is also 4th century, he said that he wanted his soul to become a stone with no feeling. Now, we should be able to appreciate the idea, right, of being able to control the passions. But again, as with everything in church history, you can take this too far, right? So this is one of the unfortunate examples of maybe a good idea, a scriptural idea, kind of taken too far. Withdrawal from society, especially a city like Alexandria. I mean, it would be like living in a place that is just full of sin and paganism and lewdness and immorality. Withdrawing from that, right, would be a very positive thing for some. Yes?
Were these because of a Gnostic influence?
Well, Alexandria was sort of the melting pot of everything at that time. So Alexandria had Gnosticism, and it had pagan philosophy. It had all sorts of mystery religions and cults. Alexandria had anything you want. It's like it was all there in Alexandria. So that sounds very interesting to us, but if you had to live in it and you're trying to live a pious Christian life, it may not have been the easiest place to do that.
It sounds a little like Austin.
Yeah, like Austin. Yeah, like keep Austin weird in Austin, right? Keep Alexandria weird in Alexandria. And Revelation. This is a very kind of charismatic, is probably the word that we would say today. A charismatic way of life, the monastic life. people have no doubt that they can receive visions and divine revelations. As with everything in the history of the church, some of these can get pretty bizarre and weird. But this is one of the things that makes the monastic life attractive, right? Because you're living in a way of life where you can hear from God. That you're probably not going to be able to hear from God if you're not going to live in that particular relation to God, especially in terms of the vows. And then service to community. This was a big thing that was debated quite a bit. Some monastics were kind of charged with being overly individualistic, really, just thinking about themselves and their relation to God. But a lot of the monastic communities, especially where you have people living together, they really did do quite a bit in terms of helping the local community around them. We have a number of examples of bishops who were monks, and they would start their own communities there in their cities. So someone like Saint Martin of Tours up in France, Saint John Chrysostom, these are monks who are also bishops. Eventually, at the Second Council of Nicaea, which is in the year 787, the churches will say that all the bishops have to be taken from the monasteries. So at this point, in the 4th century, we're getting to the place where monks may be prime candidates to become bishops, but you don't have the rule yet that somebody has to be a monk in order to become a bishop. But eventually it will get there. At the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, they will also decide that for anyone to be eligible to be a bishop, they must know the Psalter by heart. So, good luck with that one today. And then finally, demons and the supernatural. From Scripture, we know where the devil lives, right? He lives out in the wilderness, right? Where does Jesus experience his temptation? It's in the wilderness. So people have kind of had this awareness that there was something spiritually dangerous about going out into these open spaces where there was no civilization. So many of these church fathers, the desert fathers and the desert mothers, gained this reputation for being able to engage in this sort of spiritual combat against devils and demons. Now, what was the distribution of monasticism like? Well, we've talked already about Egypt and Anthony and Pomus. We also have some monasticism in Palestine. Do you remember in a previous lecture we talked about St. Jerome, who was originally from Rome, and then he moved over to Bethlehem, and he started a monastic community over there. Eventually, Palestine, the Holy Land, will become littered with literally hundreds and hundreds of monasteries and convents. Only a handful of them are still functioning today. But if you go there, you can actually visit some of these monasteries and convents that go back to the very early centuries of the church. Syria always had a reputation in church history for being kind of a place that produced weird stuff. Okay? So in Syria, they grabbed the idea of monasticism, right? We have Antony, we have Pomus, and there's sort of like an order to it, and we can kind of figure out what these men are trying to do. Well, in Syria, they're going to take this idea of withdrawing and being monachos, being alone, and do weird things. So for example, in Syria, we have a movement of people who want to wear chains. They want to live wearing chains. We have another movement of people who try to never sleep because St. Paul says, pray without ceasing. So you have to never sleep if you're going to pray without ceasing. You have a movement of individuals who want to live in nature, and so they will go about on all four eating grass from the field. I mean, pretty strange stuff. Ultimately, the bishops have to step in and say, okay, people, this is a little bit too weird for us, right? We need to chill out a little bit. But we get some great saints. So, for example, who here has heard of Saint Simon the Stylite? Saint Simon, or Saint Simeon, sometimes he's called, the Stylite. This is a guy in Syria. You can visit the remains of his pillar, but he lives on a stylus, right, which is a column. He lives on this huge column. There's this column, and he goes up on top of this thing, and he lives there for decades. And people will come to see him. They will bring him food. They will seek his advice. But here is a guy who has withdrawn himself from society to go live on top of a column. Okay, so that is weird, but here's a guy who, in spite of his weirdness, is a saint. And you will find churches named after this guy, I think even here in San Antonio. And then Asia Minor. Asia Minor, of course, is the home of the Cappadocian fathers who will become, or who are enormously influential in terms of their theology. We haven't talked about them very much in this class, though. But a number of great monasteries are open throughout Asia Minor. Then monasticism in the West. Monasticism in the East is very much, they don't have religious orders, let me put it that way. We are very used to having different religious orders, and in fact, San Antonio wouldn't be the city that it is without these different religious orders. So, St. Mary's University, that's the Society of Mary. Many of the original missions were founded by the Ordo Fratres Menores, the Order of the Little Brothers, or as we like to call them, Franciscans, right? The Pope is from what? It's actually from a society, not an order. The Jesuits, right? The Society of Jesus. Incarnate Word was founded by? Yeah, okay, good. And Our Lady of the Lake was founded by? Anybody know? I don't know. Some monastic order. Okay. So yeah, we have all these different religious orders in the West. So the guy who's normally given the credit for bringing monasticism into Europe is Saint Benedict of Nursia. And this is sometime after Anthony and Pomus are around. But he founds a great monastery on Monte Cassino in Italy, and he starts a number of other monastic communities. There are other people, too, that you can check out on Wikipedia. John Cassian is a key name that is associated with European monasticism as well. John Cassian and Augustine get into a fight about Pelagianism and the nature of grace and human free will and stuff, which fortunately is not something we're going to talk about. But John Cassian is important in terms of his influence on monasticism in the West. Today, in the Orthodox churches of the East, if someone is going to become a monk or a nun, there are not different orders. They are simply attached to, normally, the bishop, okay, or a particular church, or a particular monastery. In the West, you have this idea that you need different kinds of communities that have different charisms. So if you really believe in education, then maybe you should become a Jesuit. If you really want to help the poor, then maybe you should become a Franciscan. If you want to be a great preacher and apologist, then maybe you should become a Dominican. So this is the way that monasticism will develop in the West. It's a very versatile, flexible way that sort of acknowledges that you have lots of different kinds of people in the church who have a lot of different preferences and different ways of serving God, so that you should have a great variety of different monastic communities so these people can live out their vocations and their callings. In the East, you never have the development of religious orders like that. There is monasticism, and monasticism is just one way of life. Okay. So I mentioned St. Martin of Tours. He will become a bishop and a monk. This is a man, he's alive from 316 through 397. And he was actually ordained as an exorcist. Yeah, we don't do that anymore, do we? He developed a reputation for really just having some extraordinary supernatural powers. He was also quite involved in evangelism. But he's an example of someone who is trying to combine the monastic life with church leadership. Okay, so what can we say at the end of the day about monasticism? I'm going to give you a couple of weaknesses of monasticism. And then I'm going to give you a couple of positive things about monasticism, and we'll just wrap it up like that today. Well, first of all, one of the problems with monasticism is that it grows and it flourishes. There develops this idea, and some people blame this on St. Jerome, there develops this idea that really spiritual people are going to become monks and nuns. And then if you're just a regular guy or lady who happens to be married and stuff, you can't be as spiritual, right? So is it ever spelled out explicitly like that? I don't think so. Maybe some people, maybe Jerome does. But this becomes sort of the default thing. If you're really serious about being a Christian, then you're not going to get married and have a family. You really need to become a monk or a nun. I think this is unfortunate. I think that fortunately in the last century or so, for us 500 years ago, because of course King Henry got rid of all the monasteries, but he probably didn't have theology in mind. He probably had money in mind, but that's a different story. But I think even within the churches that have large monastic communities, especially the Roman Catholic community, you can really see that there's sort of a recovery, which I think is healthy, of the goodness of married life and the vocation of raising a family. But that was a negative thing, right? This idea that there's the real people who are serious about the Christian faith, monks and nuns, and then there's everybody else. So that's a negative thing or a weakness. Another weakness, as I noted before, was that there were some real extremes of asceticism. Another one is that sometimes the wrong people were attracted to monastic life. Some people were just looking for security, and other people were trying to escape from responsibilities that they should have been facing up to. And then finally, the popularity of monks, this kind of way of trying to live like Jesus, really captured the popular imagination of many people. And the popularity of monks, coupled with the independence of the institutional structures of the church, made the monks a kind of thorn in the side of many of the bishops. They're not supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be that the monastics are helping the bishop to carry out his mission. But in practice, historically, oftentimes that didn't happen. Oftentimes the monks were the problem, right? Not part of the solution. On the other hand, there are some very positive things about monasticism and that flowed out of monasticism. The first one is that in the history of the Christian church, all 19-odd centuries of it, the main force for the spread of Christianity has been monasticism. We normally think of sending out families or individuals to be foreign missionaries, which is obviously, I think, a great thing to do. However, that's a relatively new idea. Historically, the way that Christianity spread throughout much of Europe and then into many parts of Africa was through monastic mission. We also find a real devotion to Christ in some of the, especially the writings and the prayers of some of these monks and nuns. We find a sort of incubator for developing spiritual insight. Some of it can get pretty mystical and pretty strange, but some of the most profound writings in the history of Christian piety and in faith and spirituality come from these men and these women who took these evangelical vows. In some cases, we find a real dedication to caring for the needy. And then finally, among some of these monastics, we find an increase in scholarship. So, in many ways, a monastery, with its mutual accountability, sharing, and mission, preserved the ideals of the early Christian churches at a time when it was difficult, if not impossible, to do this in your local city parish, which was struggling to figure out, what do we do now that we're not the church of the persecuted? We are the church of the empire.